Did you know that American commanders handed one of the most dangerous provinces in Vietnam to the Australians and said, "We can't hold it, you try." Phuoc Tuy province. 4,300 square kilometers of jungle, rice paddies, and enemy. Strongholds that had been Viet Cong territory since the French withdrew. The Pentagon said it would take a full division to pacify. The Australians did it with one task force. You think you know about the Vietnam War? You're wrong. What you're about to hear isn't about American tactics or firepower. It's about a different way of fighting that made the enemy fear the jungle itself. How did 4,000 Australians control territory that 30,000 Americans couldn't? Why did Viet Cong documents specifically warn against engaging Australian units? And what made American officers call the Australians psychotic for their methods? Stay until the end, because the final battle will reveal the one word that separated survival from annihilation in Vietnam. April 6, 1966, Vung Tau, South Vietnam. The first elements of the Australian 1st Battalion arrive at the port under a sky bleached white by humidity and heat. The soldiers disembark in khaki greens, their slouch hats marking them as different from the American troops who watch from the docks. The Australians move with a deliberate calm, weapons slung casually, eyes scanning the tree line in the distance. They are veterans of jungle warfare from Malaya and Borneo. They do not speak loudly. They do not waste movement. An American major, watching the arrival, turns to his operations officer and says something that will be repeated throughout the Australian deployment. He says, "Either they're crazy or we've been doing this all wrong." The Australians have been sent to take control of Phuoc Tuy province, a coastal region southeast of Saigon that has been contested territory since the end of French colonial rule. American forces have tried to pacify the province multiple times and failed. The Viet Cong infrastructure in Phuoc Tuy is deep and sophisticated. The province contains enemy base areas, supply routes, underground hospitals, and weapons factories. The population is hostile or intimidated into compliance. Previous operations have cleared villages temporarily, but the Viet Cong always return. By early 1966, American commanders considered Phuoc Tuy a low priority. It ties down too many troops for too little strategic gain. Better to focus resources on the populated areas near Saigon and the infiltration routes from the north. But the Australian government has committed combat forces to Vietnam and needs a defined area of operations. The Americans offer Phuoc Tuy. The Australian commander, Brigadier O.D. Jackson, surveys the province and accepts. He arrives with a plan that contradicts everything the Americans have learned about fighting in Vietnam. No massive sweeps. No reliance on firepower and helicopters. No rotating units in and out every 12 months. The Australians will stay in place, learn the terrain, earn the population's trust, and hunt the Viet Cong using the methods that worked in Malaya. American advisors are skeptical. Some are openly dismissive. The Viet Cong are not the same enemy as the communist guerrillas. In Malaya, Vietnam is a different war. The Australians are too few, too lightly equipped, too wedded to outdated tactics. The Australian task force establishes its base at Nui Dat, a former rubber plantation in the center of Phuoc Tuy province. The base is surrounded by jungle and within range of enemy mortar. American doctrine would place such a base on the coast or near a major road for resupply and quick reinforcement. The Australians deliberately choose the interior. They want to be where the enemy is. They want the Viet Cong to know they are not leaving. The first patrols went out in May 1966. Australian soldiers move differently than Americans. They patrol slowly, covering perhaps 5 kilometers in a full day. They stop frequently to listen. They avoid trails and roads. They navigate through the thickest vegetation, where the enemy would not expect movement. They wear soft hats instead of helmets to hear better. They carry minimal equipment: a rifle, ammunition, water, and a day's food. No radios except for the patrol commander. No calling in artillery at the first sign of contact. The standing order is to close with the enemy and fight through, using stealth and marksmanship rather than firepower. American units operating in adjacent provinces watch with interest and confusion. American patrols move quickly, covering 15 to 20 kilometers per day. They use trails when possible to maintain speed. They carry heavy loads, radios, extra ammunition, grenades, claymore mines, smoke grenades for marking positions. When they make contact, the standard response is to pull back and call for artillery or air support. The doctrine is based on firepower superiority. Find the enemy, fix him in place, and destroy him with overwhelming force delivered from a distance. The Australian approach seems reckless to American observers. Australian patrols are smaller, more lightly armed, and operating without immediate fire support. They are slow and methodical, where Americans are fast and aggressive. They seem to be inviting ambushes. But within weeks, the results begin to speak for themselves. Australian patrols are making contact with the enemy more frequently than American units. They are killing Viet Cong in small, sharp engagements and suffering minimal casualties. Intelligence reports improve dramatically. The Australians are capturing documents, identifying enemy units, and mapping Viet Cong infrastructure with precision. The key difference is patience. Australian patrols do not rush. They take time to read the terrain. They look for signs of enemy. Presence: disturbed earth, broken vegetation, worn paths, discarded equipment. When they find these signs, they follow them carefully, setting ambushes along likely routes. They wait for hours or days if necessary. When the enemy appears, the Australians open fire at close range with devastating effect. The Viet Cong, accustomed to American units that call for artillery at the first shot, are unprepared for enemies who close the distance and fight hand-to-hand, if necessary. In June 1966, an Australian patrol from D Company 6th Battalion moved through the jungle near the village of Ho Long. The patrol commander, a sergeant with experience in Malaya, notices fresh footprints on a narrow trail. He signals the patrol to halt. They move off the trail and set up an ambush position. They wait for 3 hours without moving. The jungle heat is oppressive. Insects swarm. The soldiers do not swat them away. They remain motionless. Finally, the Viet Cong patrol of 8 men appears, walking single file down the trail. The Australians wait until the entire enemy patrol is in the kill zone. Then they open fire. The engagement lasts 20 seconds. All 8 Viet Cong were killed. The Australian patrol searches the bodies, collects documents, and withdraws before enemy reinforcements can arrive. No Australian casualties. No artillery called. No helicopters. Just patience, discipline, and marksmanship. This pattern repeats throughout the Australian area of operations. Small patrols, careful movement, deliberate ambushes. The Australians kill Viet Cong at a rate far exceeding their numbers. By the end of 1966, the Australian task force had killed an estimated 500 enemy soldiers while suffering fewer than 20 killed in action themselves. The kill ratio is approximately 25-1. American units in similar terrain are achieving ratios closer to 3 or 4-1. American commanders begin to ask questions. What are the Australians doing differently? Why are their results so much better? The answer lies not in equipment or firepower, but in training, experience, and philosophy. The Australian Army in 1966 was a professional force with extensive jungle warfare experience. Most Australian soldiers deploying to Vietnam have trained in jungle warfare for months or years. Many have served in Malaya or Borneo. They are older than American soldiers. The average age of an Australian infantryman in Vietnam is 24, compared to 19 for Americans. They are volunteers, not draftees. They have chosen to be soldiers and have been rigorously trained for this. Specific environment. The training emphasizes fieldcraft over firepower. Australian soldiers learn to move silently, to use terrain for concealment, to read signs of enemy presence, to set effective ambushes. They practice what they call jungle sense, an intuitive understanding of the environment that allows them to detect anomalies and anticipate enemy movements. This training takes time and cannot be rushed. American soldiers, rotating through Vietnam on 12-month tours, often arrive with minimal jungle training and leave just as they are gaining experience. The Australians keep units in place for longer periods, allowing institutional knowledge to accumulate. But training alone does not explain Australian success. The deeper difference is philosophical. American military doctrine in Vietnam is based on attrition. The strategy is to kill more enemy soldiers than can be replaced, using superior firepower and mobility to find and destroy enemy units. The metric of success is body count. Units are judged by how many enemies they kill. This doctrine leads to aggressive patrolling, large-scale sweeps, and heavy reliance on artillery and air support. The assumption is that more firepower equals more dead enemy equals victory. The Australian doctrine is based on pacification. The strategy is to make the enemy feel unsafe in his own territory, to disrupt his infrastructure, to separate him from the population, and to create a secure environment where government authority can function. The metric of success is not body count, but control of territory and population. This doctrine leads to patient patrolling, careful intelligence gathering, and precise application of force. The assumption is that security comes from knowledge and presence, not from firepower. The contrast becomes visible in how the two forces conduct operations. When American units sweep an area, they move through quickly, engaging any enemy they find, calling in airstrikes and artillery on suspected positions, and then moving on. The area is temporarily cleared, but the enemy returns as soon as the Americans leave. When Australian units sweep an area, they move slowly, gathering intelligence, identifying enemy infrastructure, setting ambushes on supply routes, and establishing patrol bases. They stay in the area for weeks or months, denying the enemy freedom of movement. The population sees that the Australians are not leaving, and slowly begins to cooperate. In August 1966, the Australian task force launched Operation Smithfield, a sustained operation in the eastern part of Phuoc Tuy province. The area is known to contain Viet Cong base camps and supply caches. Previous American operations have swept through the area and found nothing. The Viet Cong hide their facilities underground and disperse when threatened. The Australians approach differently. They establish patrol bases throughout the area and begin systematic patrolling. They do not announce their presence with artillery or airstrikes. They move quietly, watching and listening. Over 3 weeks, Australian patrols map the area in detail, identifying trails, water sources, and suspicious locations. They find bunker complexes, supply caches, and evidence of recent enemy activity. They set ambushes on trails and kill Viet Cong moving between bases. They capture prisoners who provide information about enemy units and leadership. By the end of the operation, the Australians had killed over 100 enemy soldiers, captured extensive supplies and documents, and driven the Viet Cong out of an area they had controlled for years. Australian casualties are minimal. American officers studying the operation note the contrast with their own methods. An American operation would have used helicopters to insert large forces, conducted aggressive sweeps, and withdrawn after a few days. The Australian operation used no helicopters for insertion, moved slowly on foot, and stayed in place for weeks. The Australian method produced better intelligence and more lasting results, but required patience and discipline that American units, under pressure to produce quick results, struggled to maintain. The patience extends to how Australians engage the enemy. American units are trained to break contact when ambushed and call for support. The doctrine assumes that small units cannot fight effectively against larger enemy forces without fire support. Australian units are trained to fight through ambushes. The doctrine assumes that immediate aggressive action creates confusion and gives the smaller force an advantage. When Australian patrols are ambushed, they assault directly into the ambush, firing as they move, closing the distance to deny the enemy the advantage of prepared positions. This tactic is dangerous and requires exceptional discipline, but it works. Viet Cong documents captured later in the war specifically warn against ambushing Australian patrols because the Australians do not withdraw but attack the ambush position directly. The most famous example of this aggressive response occurs on August 18, 1966, at the Battle of Long Tan. D Company, 6th Battalion, is on a patrol outside the Nui database when it encounters a large Viet Cong force. What begins as a small contact escalates rapidly as more enemy troops appear. The company commander realizes he is facing not a patrol, but a regiment, perhaps 2,000 enemy soldiers. The Australians are outnumbered more than 10 to 1. American doctrine would call for immediate withdrawal and massive fire support. The Australian commander does something different. He orders his company to form a defensive position and fight in place. He calls for artillery support, but does not withdraw. For 3 hours, 108 Australian soldiers fought against 2,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops in a rubber plantation during a monsoon rainstorm. The Australians form a tight perimeter and use disciplined rifle fire to hold off wave after wave of attacks. The enemy expects them to break and run. The Australians do not. They fire carefully, conserving ammunition, targeting enemy leaders and machine gun positions. Artillery support from the Nui Dat base keeps enemy reinforcements at bay. The Australians hold until reinforcements arrive just before dark. When the battle ended, the Australians had killed an estimated 245 enemy soldiers. Australian casualties are 18 killed and 24 wounded. The enemy regiment withdraws in disorder and does not attempt another large-scale attack on the Australian base for the remainder of the war. Long Tan became legendary within the Australian Army and gradually among American forces as well. The battle demonstrates that small, well-trained units can defeat much larger enemy forces through discipline and aggression. But more importantly, it demonstrates a mindset. The Australians did not panic when outnumbered. They did not call for extraction. They stood and fought, trusting their training and each other. American officers studying the battle note that an American company in the same situation would likely have attempted to break contact and withdraw. The Australian decision to stand and fight seemed almost suicidal, yet it succeeded. The word psychotic begins to appear in American assessments of Australian tactics. It is not used clinically, but colloquially, expressing a mix of admiration and disbelief. Australian units seem willing to take risks that American units avoid. They patrol in smaller numbers. They close with the enemy instead of using standoff. Firepower. They operate at night when American policy generally prohibits movement. They set ambushes in areas the Americans consider too dangerous. To observers accustomed to American doctrine, the Australian approach seems reckless. But the results suggest otherwise. By late 1966, Viet Cong activity in Phuoc Tuy province had declined significantly. Villages that were under enemy control are now accessible to government officials. Roads that were impassable due to mines and ambushes are being cleared. The province is not pacified. It will take years, but it is contested in ways it was not before the Australians arrived. The enemy no longer moves freely. He must account for Australian patrols that could appear anywhere at any time. He must protect his supply routes and base areas instead of using them with impunity. The symbolic weapon in this transformation is not technology or firepower, but the sound of silence. Australian patrols move through the jungle without the noise that accompanies American operations. No helicopters announcing their presence. No radio chatter. No calling in artillery on suspected positions. Just the quiet movement of men who know how to use the jungle instead of fighting against it. The Viet Cong, accustomed to hearing American units from kilometers away, find themselves surprised by Australians who appear without warning. The psychological effect is profound. The jungle, which the Viet Cong consider their sanctuary, becomes a place of danger. They can no longer assume they are safe in areas far from roads or bases. Australians can be anywhere. This silence becomes more than a tactic. It becomes a philosophy that permeates Australian operations. Where Americans use technology to overcome uncertainty, Australians use skill and patience. Where Americans rely on communication and coordination, Australians rely on individual initiative and small unit cohesion. Where Americans seek to dominate the environment through firepower, Australians seek to blend into it through fieldcraft. The differences are not absolute. Both forces adapt and learn from each other, but the emphasis is distinct. The Australian approach to the population also differs. American units conduct civil affairs operations with dedicated teams and extensive resources. They build schools, dig wells, and provide medical care. The efforts are genuine and often effective, but they are separate from combat operations. Australian units integrate civil affairs into routine patrolling. Australian soldiers talk to villagers during patrols, using interpreters when available, but also learning basic Vietnamese. They buy food and supplies from local markets, rather than relying entirely on military logistics. They employ local labor for base construction. These interactions are not part of a formal program, but simply how Australians believe soldiers should behave. The effect is to create personal relationships between soldiers and civilians that provide intelligence and gradually shift loyalty away from the Viet Cong. In late 1966, an Australian patrol stopped in a village to fill canteens from a well. The patrol commander, a corporal, notices an old woman watching them nervously. He approaches her and, through an interpreter, asks if she is well. She is reluctant to speak, but finally says that Viet Cong cadres came to the village the previous night and demanded food. The corporal thanks her and reports this to intelligence. Over the following week, Australian patrols set ambushes on trails leading to the village. They intercept a Viet Cong supply party and kill 3 enemy soldiers. The supplies, rice, and medical supplies are traced back to the village. The Australian commander does not punish the village, but instead stations a patrol base nearby to protect it from future Viet Cong intimidation. Over time, the village becomes a source of reliable intelligence. The old woman who first spoke to the corporal becomes an informal informant, passing information to Australian patrols when they pass through. This approach takes time and cannot be measured in body counts, but it produces results that firepower alone cannot achieve. Villages that provide intelligence become less accessible to the Viet Cong. Enemy movements become predictable. The population gradually shifts from passive resistance to cautious cooperation. Australians call this winning hearts and minds, but they approach it differently than Americans. For Americans, It is a program with resources and metrics. For Australians, it is simply how they operate talking to people, treating them with respect, protecting them when possible, and building trust over time. The contrast in philosophies creates tension. Some American officers admire the Australian methods and try to adapt them. Others dismiss the Australians as too cautious, too slow, too small scale. The criticism is that Australian tactics might work in a single province with limited resources. But they cannot win the war. Vietnam requires a larger strategy, more firepower, more mobility. The Australian approach is interesting, but not scalable. The debate reflects different visions of warfare. Americans see war as a problem to be solved with technology and resources. Australians see war as a test of human qualities, patience, discipline, skill. It cannot be replaced by machines. In 1967, the Australian task force expanded to include a 3rd Battalion and supporting units. The force now numbers over 4,000 soldiers. They continue patrolling Phuoc Tuy province using the same methods. The results remain consistent. Australian kill ratios stay above 20-1. Enemy activity in the province continues to decline. Villages become more secure. The Viet Cong avoid areas where Australians patrol regularly. When forced to fight, the enemy suffers disproportionate casualties. But the war is not going well overall. American forces are increasing to over 500,000 men. Casualties are rising on both sides. The enemy shows no sign of collapse despite enormous losses. The strategy of attrition is not producing victory. American commanders begin to question their own methods. Some look to the Australians for lessons. In 1968, American units began experimenting with smaller patrols, slower movement, and less reliance on firepower. The results are mixed. American soldiers, trained for aggressive action and quick results, struggle with the patience required for Australian-style operations. The institutional culture is different. American officers are judged by measurable results: enemy killed, territory cleared, operations conducted. Australian officers are judged by qualitative assessments: intelligence gathered, population secured, enemy disrupted. The metrics shape behavior. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 changed the war's trajectory. The Viet Cong launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, striking cities and bases simultaneously. The attacks are eventually repulsed with heavy enemy losses, but the psychological impact is devastating. American public opinion turns against the war. The perception that the enemy is being defeated through attrition collapses. In Phuoc Tuy province, the Tet attacks are limited. The Viet Cong attempt to seize several district towns, but are driven off by Australian and South Vietnamese forces. The Australian base at Nui Dat is mortared, but not seriously threatened. The reason for the limited attacks is clear. The Viet Cong infrastructure in Phuoc Tuy has been degraded by 2 years of Australian operations. The enemy lacks the strength to mount large-scale attacks. American commanders note this with interest. Phuoc Tuy is one of the few provinces where Tet does not significantly disrupt government control. The Australian approach, slow and methodical, has produced resilience that the American strategy of aggressive sweeps has not. But the lesson comes too late to change the broader war. American policy shifts toward Vietnamization training south. Vietnamese forces to take over the fighting, while American forces gradually withdraw. The Australians continue their operations in Phuoc Tuy, but know their time is limited. In 1969 and 1970, Australian patrols continued to hunt the Viet Cong with undiminished effectiveness. The enemy is weaker now, his infrastructure disrupted, his fighters demoralized. Captured documents reveal that Viet Cong units specifically avoid Australian areas of operations when possible. One document, captured in 1970, instructs cadres to move around Australian positions rather than through them, because the Australians patrol constantly and ambush aggressively. The document warns that Australian patrols cannot be heard approaching and will pursue when fired upon rather than withdraw. This is the ultimate validation of Australian tactics. The enemy fears them not for their firepower, but for their skill. By 1971, Australian forces began withdrawing from Vietnam. The war is being turned over to South Vietnamese forces. The Australian task force hands over Phuoc Tuy province to a South Vietnamese division. The Australians leave behind a province that is more secure than it was in 1966, but still contested. The Viet Cong have not been eliminated, only suppressed. Without constant pressure, they will return. And they do. By 1975, when North Vietnamese forces overran South Vietnam, Phuoc Tuy fell like the rest of the country. The Australian effort, for all its tactical success, could not change the strategic outcome, but the legacy of Australian operations in Vietnam extends beyond the immediate results. The Australian approach demonstrated that there were alternatives to American methods, that firepower and technology, for all their advantages, could not replace skill and patience, that small, well-trained units could achieve results that large, heavily equipped forces could not, that understanding the enemy and the environment was more important than dominating them through force. These lessons influenced military thinking in many countries, including eventually the United States. The symbolic sound of silence, the quiet movement of Australian patrols through the jungle represented a different philosophy of warfare. It was warfare as craft rather than industry. Warfare that emphasized human qualities over technological superiority. Warfare that required time and patience rather than quick results. The Australians succeeded not because they were more aggressive or more willing to take casualties, but because they were more patient and more skilled. They accepted that some problems cannot be solved quickly, that some enemies cannot be defeated by firepower alone, that sometimes the slow, careful approach produces better results than the fast, aggressive one. The American officers who called the Australians psychotic were recognizing something true but misunderstanding its nature. The Australians were not reckless, they were confident. Confidence born from training, from experience, from a belief that skill and discipline could overcome numerical and technological disadvantages. They did not take unnecessary risks. They calculated risks carefully and accepted them when the mission required. They fought differently because they thought differently, and they thought differently because they had been trained differently. The broader lesson is about organizational culture and how it shapes performance. The Australian Army in Vietnam was a small professional force with a strong culture of excellence. Selection was rigorous. Training was extensive. Leadership was decentralized. Soldiers were expected to think and make decisions without constant supervision. This culture produced soldiers who could operate effectively in small groups without support. The American Army was a large conscript force with rapid turnover and centralized control. Selection was less rigorous. Training was shorter and focused on conventional operations. Leadership was more hierarchical. Soldiers were expected to follow orders and call for support when needed. This culture produced soldiers who excelled in large-scale operations with ample support, but struggled in small unit actions requiring initiative. Neither culture was superior in all circumstances. American forces achieved extraordinary results. In Vietnam, in many operations, they won virtually every major battle. They inflicted massive casualties on the enemy. They demonstrated courage and adaptability under difficult conditions. But in the specific environment of Phuoc Tuy province, conducting sustained counterinsurgency operations against an elusive enemy, the Australian culture and methods proved more effective. A lesson is not that one approach is always better, but that different approaches suit different contexts. The key is matching methods to circumstances and having the flexibility to change when necessary. In April 1971, the last Australian infantry battalion departed Vietnam. They leave behind a record of tactical excellence that is studied in military schools around the world. Over 5 years of operations, Australian forces killed an estimated 3,000 enemy soldiers, while suffering fewer than 500 killed in action. The kill ratio exceeded 15-1 over the entire deployment. No other Allied force in Vietnam achieved comparable results. The Australian success was not due to superior equipment or numbers. It was due to superior training, discipline, and tactical approach. The soldiers who served in Vietnam returned to Australia with mixed feelings. They had fought well and achieved their tactical objectives, but the war was lost, and their efforts, however successful, could not change that outcome. Many felt that their sacrifices were not fully appreciated. Australia's involvement in Vietnam was controversial, and returning soldiers faced protests and indifference. The recognition they deserved came slowly, sometimes decades later, but within the military profession, their performance was recognized and respected. The Australian approach in Vietnam became a case study in effective counterinsurgency operations. Jungle nights in Phuoc Tuy province are quiet now. The trails where Australian soldiers set their ambushes have been reclaimed by vegetation. The villages where they talked with farmers and gathered intelligence have changed or disappeared. The rubber plantation at Long Tan, where 108 men held off 2,000, is now a memorial visited by veterans and historians. The war is long over, and the passions it stirred have faded. But the lessons remain. The Australian experience in Vietnam demonstrated that success in war depends not only on resources and technology, but on how those resources are employed. That doctrine and training matter more than equipment. That patience and skill can compensate for numerical inferiority. Understanding the enemy and the environment is essential. That cultural factors, how soldiers are selected, trained, and honed, lead shape performance in profound ways. These are timeless lessons, as relevant now as they were in the jungles of Vietnam. The word psychotic that American officers used to describe Australian tactics was both a compliment and a misunderstanding. A compliment because it recognized something exceptional in Australian performance. A misunderstanding because it attributed to madness what was actually careful calculation. The Australians were not crazy. They were competent. They did things that seemed impossible because they had trained to do those things. They took risks that seemed suicidal because they had prepared to manage those risks. They succeeded where others failed because they approached the problem differently. The final truth is this: excellence in warfare, as in any demanding profession, comes from a combination of selection, training, culture, and leadership. Technology and resources matter, but they cannot substitute for human qualities. The Australians in Vietnam proved this. They were given a task that American forces considered impossible, pacifying Phuoc Tuy province with minimal resources and support. They succeeded not through firepower or technology, but through patience, skill, and discipline. They became the standard by which other forces measured themselves. And when the last Australian patrol walked out of the jungle in 1971, they left behind something more than tactical victories. They left a legacy of professionalism and competence that continues to inspire soldiers around the world. They proved that a small force of well-trained professionals can achieve what large conventional forces cannot. That silence can be more effective than noise. That patience can overcome aggression. That skill matters more than size. The jungle is quiet now. The war is over, but the lesson endures. In war, as in life, how you fight matters as much as whether you win. The Australians in Vietnam fought with honor, skill, and courage. They did not win the war. No one did. But they won every battle they fought. They proved that even in the darkest jungles, even against overwhelming odds, discipline and competence can prevail. That is their legacy. That is why decades later, their story is still told. That is why the word psychotic became a badge of honor. Because sometimes doing the impossible just requires the discipline to do things the right way, no matter how difficult that is.